Chapter 25, Part 6 of Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 25. Louis XI, 1461 to 1483, Part 6. Between the two rivals in France, relations with England were a subject of constant manoeuvring and strife. In spite of reverses on the continent and civil wars in their own island, the kings of England had not abandoned their claims to the crown of France. They were still in possession of Calais, and the memory of the battles of Crecy, Poitiers, and Agincourt was still a tower of strength to them. Between 1470 and 1472, the House of York had triumphed over the House of Lancaster, and Edward IV. was undisputed king. In his views touching France, he found a natural ally in the Duke of Burgundy, and it was in concert with Charles that Edward was incessantly concocting and attempting plots and campaigns against Louis XI. In 1474 he, by a herald, called upon Louis to give up to him Normandy and Guienne, else, he told him, he would cross over to France with his army. "Tell your master," answered Louis coolly, "that I should not advise him to." Next year the herald returned to tell Louis that the King of England, on the point of embarking, called upon him to give up to him the kingdom of France. Louis had a conversation with the herald. "Your king," said he, "is undertaking this war against his own grain, at the solicitation of the Duke of Burgundy. He would do much better to live in peace with me, instead of devoting himself to allies who cannot but compromise him, without doing him any service." And he had 300 golden crowns presented to the herald, with a promise of considerably more if peace were made. The herald, thus won over, promised, in his turn, to do all he could, saying that he believed that his master would lend a willing ear, but that, before mentioning the subject, they must wait until Edward had crossed the sea and formed some idea of the difficulties in the way of his enterprise. And he advised Louis to establish communications with my lord Howard and my lord Stanley, who had great influence with King Edward. Whilst the king was parleying with the said herald, there were many folks in the hall, says Commynes, who were waiting, and had great longing to know what the king was saying to him, and what countenance he would wear when he came from within. The king, when he had made an end, called me, and told me to keep the said herald talking, so that none might speak to him, and to have delivered unto him a piece of crimson velvet containing 30 ells. So did I, and the king was right joyous at that which he had got out of the said herald. It was now 3 years since Philip de Comm had left the Duke of Burgundy's service to enter that of Louis XI. In 1471 Charles had, none knows why, rashly authorized an interview between Louis and de Commynes. "The king's speech," says the chronicler Molinet, in the Duke of Burgundy's service, "was so sweet and full of virtue that it entranced, siren-like, all those who gave ear to it. Of all princes," says Commynes himself, "he was the one who was at most pains to gain over a man who was able to serve him and able to injure him, and he was not put out at being refused once by one whom he was working to gain over, but continued thereat, making him large promises, and actually giving money and estate when he made acquaintances that were pleasing to him." Commynes spoke according to his own experience. Louis, from the moment of making his acquaintance, had guessed his value, and, as early as 1468, in the course of his disagreeable adventure at Peronne, he had found the good offices of Commynes of great service to him. It was probably from this very time that he applied himself assiduously to the task of gaining him over. Commynes hesitated a long while, but Louis was even more perseveringly persistent than Commynes was hesitating. The king backed up his handsome offers by substantial and present gifts. In 1471, according to what appears, he lent Commynes 6,000 livres of Tours, which the Duke of Burgundy's councillor lodged with a banker at Tours. The next year, the king, seeing that Commynes was still slow to decide, bade one of his councillors to go to Tours, in his name, and seize at the banker's the 6,000 livres entrusted to the latter by Commynes. "This," says the learned editor of the last edition of Commynes' Memoires, "was an able and decisive blow. The effect of the seizure could not but be, and indeed was, to put Commynes in the awkward dilemma of seeing his practices, as the saying was at that time, divulged without reaping the fruit of them, or of securing the advantages only by setting aside the scruples which held him back. He chose the latter course, which had become the safer, and, during the night between the 7th and 8th of August, 1472, he left Burgundy for ever. The king was at that time at Pont de Ce, and there his new servant joined him. The very day of his departure, at 6 A.M., or to have my acknowledgments found in his exchequer chamber." Lord Hastings had not always been so scrupulous, for, on the 15th of May 1471, he had received from the Duke of Burgundy a pension for which he had given an acknowledgment. Another Englishman, whose name is not given by Commynes, waxed wroth at hearing some one say, "600 pipes of wine and a pension given you by the king soon sent you back to England." "That is certainly what everybody said," answered the Englishman, "that you might have the laugh against us; but call you the money the king gives us pension? Why, it is tribute, and by St. George, you may perhaps talk so much about it as to bring us down upon you again." "There was nothing in the world," says Commynes, "of which the king was more fearful than, lest any word should escape him to make the English think that they were being derided; at the same time that he was laboring to gain them over, he was careful to humor their susceptibilities." And Commynes, under his schooling, had learned to understand them well. "They are rather slow goers," says he, "but you must have a little patience with them and not lose your temper. I fancy that to many it might appear that the king abased himself too much; but the wise might well hold that the kingdom was in great danger, save for the intervention of God, who did dispose the king's mind to choose so wise a course, and did greatly trouble that of the Duke of Burgundy. Our king knew well the nature of the King of England, who was very fond of his ease and his pleasures. When he had concluded these treaties with him, he ordered that the money should be found with the greatest expedition, and every one had to lend somewhat to help to supply it on the spot. The king said that there was nothing in the world he would not do to thrust the King of England out of the realm, save only that he would never consent that the English should have a bit of territory there, and rather than suffer that, he would put everything to jeopardy and risk." Commynes had good reason to say that the kingdom was in great peril. The intentions of Charles the Rash tended to nothing short of bringing back the English into France in order to share it with them. He made no concealment of it. "I am so fond of the kingdom," said he, "that I would make 6 of it in France." He was passionately eager for the title of king. He had put out feelers for it in the direction of Germany, and the emperor, Frederick III., had promised it to him together with that of vicar general of the empire, on condition that his daughter, Mary of Burgundy, married Duke Maximilian, Frederick's son. Having been unsuccessful on the Rhine, Charles turned once more towards the Thames, and made alliance with Edward IV., King of England, with a view of renewing the English invasion of France, flattering himself, of course, that he would profit by it. To destroy the work of Joan of Arc and Charles VII., such was the design, a criminal and a shameful one for a French prince, which was checkmated by the Peace of Picquigny. Charles himself acknowledged as much when, in his wrath at this treaty, he said, he had not sought to bring over the English into France for any need he had of them, but to enable them to recover what belonged to them. And Louis XI. Was a patriotic king when he declared that there was nothing in the world he would not do to thrust the King of England out of the realm, and rather than suffer the English to have a bit of territory in France, he would put everything to jeopardy and risk. The Duke of Burgundy, as soon as he found out that the King of France had, under the name of truce, made peace for 7 years with the King of England, and that Edward IV. Had recrossed the Channel with his army, saw that his attempts, so far, were a failure. Accordingly, he too lost no time in signing, on the 13th of September 1475, a truce with King Louis for 9 years, and directing his ambition and aiming his blows against other quarters than western France. 2 little states, his neighbors on the east, Lorraine and Switzerland, became the object and the theatre of his passion for war. Lorraine had at that time for its duke René II., of the house of Anjou through his mother Yolande, a young prince who was wavering, as so many others were, between France and Burgundy. Charles suddenly entered Lorraine, took possession of several castles, had the inhabitants who resisted hanged, besieged Nancy, which made a valiant defence, and ended by conquering the capital as well as the country places, leaving Duke René no asylum but the court of Louis XI., of whom the Lorraine prince had begged a support which Louis, after his custom, had promised without rendering it effectual. Charles did not stop there. He had already been more than once engaged in hostilities with his neighbours the Swiss, and he now learned that they had just made a sanguinary raid upon the district of Vaud, the domain of a petty prince of the house of Savoy, and a devoted servant of the Duke of Burgundy. Scarcely 2 months after the capture of Nancy, Charles set out, on the 11th of June, 1476, to go and avenge his client, and wreak his haughty and turbulent humour upon these bold peasants of the Alps. In spite of the truce he had but lately concluded with Charles the Rash, the prudent Louis did not cease to keep an attentive watch upon him, and to reap advantage against him from the leisure secured to the King of France by his peace with the King of England and the Duke of Brittany. A late occurrence had still further strengthened his position. His brother Charles, who became Duke of Guienne in 1469 after the Treaty of Peronne, had died on the 24th of May, 1472. There were sinister rumours abroad touching his death. Louis was suspected, and even accused to the Duke of Brittany, an intimate friend of the deceased prince, of having poisoned his brother. He caused an inquiry to be instituted into the matter, but the inquiry itself was accused of being incomplete and inconclusive. King Louis did not, possibly, cause his brother's death, said M. de Barante, but nobody thought him incapable of it. The will which Prince Charles had dictated a little before his death increased the horror inspired by such a suspicion. He manifested in it a feeling of affection and confidence towards the king his brother. He requested him to treat his servants kindly, and if in any way, he added, we have ever offended our right dread and right well beloved brother, we do beg him to be pleased to forgive us, since, for our part, if ever in any matter he hath offended us, we do affectionately pray the divine Majesty to forgive him, and with good courage and good will do we on our part forgive him. The Duke of Guienne at the same time appointed the king executor of his will. If we acknowledge, however, that Louis was not incapable of such a crime, it must be admitted that there is no trustworthy proof of his guilt. At any rate, his brother's death had important results for him. Not only did it set him free from all fresh embarrassment in that direction, but it also restored to him the beautiful province of Guienne and many a royal client. He treated the friends of Prince Charles, whether they had or had not been heretofore his own, with marked attention. He re-established at Bordeaux the parliament he had removed to Poitiers. He pardoned the towns of Pazenas and Montignac for some late seditions, and lastly, he took advantage of this incident to pacify and satisfy this portion of the kingdom. Of the great feudal chieftains who, in 1464, had formed against him the League of the Common Weal, the Duke of Burgundy was the only one left on the scene, and in a condition to put him in peril. End of chapter 25, part 6.